Now, Sally's joined me at the table here, which means it's time for our daily review of the national and international headlines. Let's see what's making news around the world. Let's start with the international New York Times. It leads with the Ebola crisis in West Africa. Really distressing picture on the front page there, but it says that areas that had been spared from the virus up until now are under threat, and that there's a lack of Western intervention, which means that they're not prepared.
Dominating the UK papers, including The Times, Prime Minister Davies Camberton has pledged to cut taxes for low-income earners. He made the announcement at the final Conservative Party conference ahead of a general election next year.
Then let's take you to the Financial Times. It says that some of the world's largest banks have stopped contributing to dozens of financial benchmarks to avoid risking litigation. It's in the wake of the LIBOR and the foreign exchange rate rigging scandals.
The Moscow Times reports on the Russian economic slump and its effect on alcohol production and consumption there. It says beer is on the way down while vodka is going up.
Somewhat counterintuitive, perhaps, but let's take it to the FT now. Inside the FT, they've asked the question, where is the best place to do business, the UK or the US? It's an interesting time for both regions, the paper says, but the rise of Asian hubs in the financial world is still challenging them.
And let's end with Gulf News, where we get an idea of what the world's wealthiest people are spending their money on. It turns out high-income earners there are looking to spend more on experiences like travel and concerts, as opposed to material items, probably because they've already got the material items,
like all
maybe?
those Rolls Royces that you were looking at earlier. OK, joining us from the strategic communications consultancy Camberton is the managing director and founder, Mark Davies, to go through some of his papers. Mark, very nice to see you again. Thanks very much for coming in. Let's start off with this growing international crisis, as highlighted by the international New York Times, Ebola.
Yeah.
Do you think the world is starting to wake up to the fact that this is not just a West African problem?
Yeah, it's taken them a while to do it. This has been going for more than 6 months now. As you say, this photo is quite harrowing. The story itself, there's some description here which is really quite terrifying. Yes, they are starting to wake up to it. As you say, there's going to be a conference in London. And they've realised that the economic impact,
well, yeah.
Yes, absolutely. Perhaps that's part of the reason, because it's starting to impact countries, and there is concern that it might catch on. For a long time, nobody's done anything about it. Nobody's really been conscious of the potential impact. But the economic impact in West Africa is potentially enormous, up to $500 million, they say it could impact in Liberia. So yes, we're finally waking up to it, I think.
I think governments, like I think the British Department for International Development, would say that it has been doing quite a lot. I think they've sort of said they donated £125 million to West Africa, but the point is it's spreading so fast and so wide now that that's probably not enough.
Well, I think for a long time we talked about the fact that it was non-contagious and it was easily be contained within West Africa, and now that we have a case that's appeared in the United States, I think suddenly people are changing their view.
And you just talked about the economic impact there, which just those numbers you were saying, for some $439 million as the worst case scenario, long-term economic impact for Sierra Leone, coming from a think tank in Washington called the Centre for Global Development, doing some research and suggesting that even when this outbreak is contained, those economic effects are going to be felt for much longer.
Yeah, and this is a World Bank study that came out on the 17th of September. So again, this is very recent stuff. I mean, we first heard about this, I think it was in December last year. So this is getting on for a year now since this first broke. And yet these are the first studies that we're starting to get through in the last couple of weeks.
And they're incredibly poor countries anyway. That was part of the problem. They don't have the infrastructure, the health services to tackle this kind of thing.
$500 million in the context of Liberia. That's a very
and Guinea. Let's look at the Times front page, and all the papers in the UK are dominated by this. So we're marking it with this particular one. Cameron's £7 billion tax giveaway to the middle classes. Obviously, he said a lot more than that. This is the element that
he did. I was there yesterday, actually, in the hall as he spoke. And of course, it's the tax that's going to cause all the headlines. It's across every paper. I think he was significantly more powerful on the NHS. That was the moment in the hall that everybody was absolutely silent. You could hear a pin drop, and then it went from that to an enormous crescendo as he went very, very aggressively for the Labour Party, saying, "How dare you say that I would not do good by the NHS, given my own personal experience." It was a very powerful moment in the hall. Of course, the numbers, what people have focused on in the newspapers, the potential tax giveaway, which is very interesting because, of course, if this had come from Ed Miliband last week, people would have said, how on earth are you going to fund that?
But people are saying that today.
Well, they
it's
are.
Highlighted in this article.
Absolutely. And it's quite right that it should be highlighted around. But Cameron is taking a gamble here, that he has got himself a reputation on the economy which allows him to make this kind of uncosted pledge and get away with it. It'll be very interesting to see coming up into the election whether that resonates or not.
But how is that going to help? I mean, governments around the world are dealing with deficits, so if coming into an election the Prime Minister is promising tax cuts, that's going to reduce revenue to the government. How's
Yes, but don't forget this is quite clever politics, because he's promised a tax cut in the next government, and that could be up to 2020. So he could stand by this pledge and not do anything until 2019, which is quite a long way down the line. Interestingly, I think that the most important thing he said yesterday was actually what he said about Europe and how he would go and challenge the freedom of movement, which is absolutely fundamental to the European Union and the Treaty of Rome. And that will be the thing that will come out of this in the longer term, I think. That will be the thing on which his legacy is based.
Very quickly, Mark, let's just note this story. Front page of the International Financial Times, the UKFT, it's there as well, but it's a bit smaller under a picture of David Cameron. What's going on here? Banks changing their behaviour because of fear of scrutiny.
Yes, because they've been sued. I have a couple of clients that have sued banks over LIBOR issues in recent months. And the banks, probably better not, the banks have decided that by virtue of their contribution to these benchmarks, they leave themselves open to litigation, and it's a risk that's not worth taking. Of course, the issue for investors on that is that some of the benchmarks, if the banks don't contribute numbers, and instead they just rely on the flows and the trades, some of the benchmarks simply won't exist. And that means, from an investment point of view, you've got nothing to judge your performance against, which is quite important.
So it's an unintended consequence, isn't it, of all the kind of scrutiny now, because of manipulation of interbank lending rates in London, foreign exchange markets.
Indeed.
It's going to happen.
Yeah.
Let's move on to the Moscow Times, because it's alerting us to the fact that Russians are turning to vodka as beer prices rise. I'm not sure the Russians necessarily turn their backs on vodka at any point, but beer prices are on the rise as an impact of an general economic downturn. I'm wondering if this has anything to do with sanctions. What do you think?
No, I don't think it is about sanctions. It's about the taxes that are charged on alcohol in Russia. I agree with you. I was quite surprised by this. I lived in Moscow for a while, and the vodka consumption is extraordinary. And of course, the problem is that it's not just the regulated vodka, it's the illegal vodka, which is that much more dangerous. And of course, this is really a health story for Russia, because the alcohol consumption is enormous. And the issue is that the taxes in Russia on the different forms of alcohol don't really differentiate in the same way as they do elsewhere. And that's why vodka's cheap relative to beer.
Okay, we're going to jump to Gulf News now and talk about the fact that the high earners there are splurging on experiences as opposed to things.
Yes,
Not
supposedly.
This
is a little bit of a survey. This is a great sort of PR story that's been put out by American Express so they can tell people how much people use their credit cards. I mean, the story is that in the UAE, people will go for experience rather than the luxury goods that you would expect.
They've got the luxury goods.
As you say, they've got all the luxury goods, and it's only until 2015, and then apparently their behaviour will change.
What a lovely dilemma to have,
year,
isn't it?
Indeed.
Okay,
Nice.
Mark Davies, always very nice to have you here. Thank you very much for coming in and joining us. Stay with us. Sally and I will both be back with more headlines.
And if you're in the UK, you will join the breakfast team on BBC1. Have a lovely day. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.